Welcome back to the shop, my friends. Steve here at SKS Props, and this is part 4 in my EVA Foam Dragon build series. If you haven't checked out parts 1 through 3 yet, be sure to do that because in those build videos, I went over the fabrication process for you to make your own dragon head and wall mount plaque. In this part 4 video, we're going to take a deep dive into the painting process because paint makes or breaks a prop. And you guys know me, I love painting and I love my layers. And this dragon is of no exception. There are a ton of different layers that go into making it look the way it does, but don't be worried because I'm going to show you all those steps. So let's go ahead and get started. Before I start painting, I want to add a little detailed heraldry to the plaque. So I laser cut some tiny double-headed battle axes. I didn't want something really elaborate to detract away from the dragon's head, but I think these turned out great. Plus, this is another way to add your own custom embellishments and make the plaque unique for you. I wanted the plaque to have a little bit of texture, so I'm doing the tinfoil technique by heating up the foam and pressing some tinfoil to emboss the surface. Now in heating foam, always remember to wear your respirator and work in a well-ventilated area. I also added a few battle-damaged nicks here and there with my rotary tool. The foam clay on the dragon's jaw has had more than enough time to dry, so I can now take some very fine sandpaper and blend it into the surface. Before I add any paint or primer, I need to cover up these eyes by using some masking tape. I'd recommend to check the stickiness of the tape just so it doesn't leave a residue on the bulbs. To start off, we're going to coat the dragon's head and the plaque with 2 light coats of Placque dip. I'd like to add a texture to the foam just so it's not completely smooth, so I'm going to use some Valspar stone spray. Before the spray has a chance to cure, I remove it from the teeth and the tongue. And as you can see here, it just adds a little bit extra texture to the piece. And now it's time for Placque dip round 2. This time in between the coats I did a light sanding on the stone texture. This knocked it down just a little bit, and then I could spray my final coat of Placque dip on top. To give the paint something to stick to, I can now add a primer layer to the dragon and the plaque by using Krylon Flat Black. On top of this, I'm going to dust on a layer of Krylon Red Oxide. Now I decided for my dragon with those fiery eyes, I was going to paint him green as a great contrast. So my first base layer of paint is going to be an ultra flat camouflage green. With all spray paints, this is just dusted onto the surface, trying to avoid the mouth and the horns. On top of the dark green as a highlight, I'm going to be using some Valspar Flat light green. With this color, I try to be a little more selective of where it was sprayed. For the base color on the plaque, I'm going to be using one of my favorite metallics, Rust-Oleum Flat Antique Nickel. To smooth out the surface and fill the pores in the foam, I'm going to be adding some graphite powder. I apply the graphite powder with a shop towel, and then I can buff the surface with a clean one. And here's the difference between the non-treated and the treated side. The powder was also applied to all of the foam dowels along the perimeter of the piece. Now back to the dragon, and it's time to add a wash. And normally when I do washes I add dark colors, but this time we're going to mix it up. I'm going to combine some Liquitex Cobalt Green and Ultramarine Blue. This is going to be a really cool wash color that's going to blend into the greens that are already laid down. The wash is generously applied all over the piece using a 1-inch mop brush and a bunch of water. I could then go back and remove some of it using a damp paper towel. But you can see how the paint stays within the recesses. And remember, you can always speed up the dry time using a hairdryer. For the inside of the mouth, I'm going to mix up some Liquitex Medium Magenta and Unbleached Titanium. Now these colors on their own are fairly opaque, so they do a good job covering, which is why I need to go back and take some of that paint away. The whole point here is to let some of those base primer colors to show through. This paint mixture is also applied directly to the tongue. For the shadowed areas of the mouth, I mix in a little bit of that ultramarine blue that I'd used earlier. While I let the inside of the mouth dry, I can apply a very light layer to the gum line. Any excess paint that goes where you don't want, just use a damp paper towel to help remove it. I can now remove the masking tape from the eyes, and you can see how that fiery red color of the eyes goes great with this cool green. I mix up more of that green and blue, but this time I add little to no water. This will make sure that the pigment count is much higher and it'll cover a lot better than that wash. The pink mixture for the inside of the mouth was also mixed with this and then added to either side of the eyeball. I could then go in with the detail brush and the undiluted pink to really make this color pop. An additional layer of the pink is now going to be added using more water than before. It's going to act like a glaze. And while the paint is still wet, I can take a dry paintbrush and feather the strokes. This is going to help make the paint appear a lot more natural. Going back to the dragon's tongue, I can now stipple on a thicker but lighter version of that pink. I'm going to start by adding this paint to the surface sporadically using a well-worn filbert brush. But then while the paint is still damp, I go back with a larger mop brush, and this is going to help diffuse the surface. This same color application process could then be applied to the inside of the mouth and the gums. For the top of the dragon's head, I'm going to mix some cadmium-free yellow with more of that cobalt green. This is going to make a really awesome color shift to the top and the sides of the dragon's head. Plus, this is going to be a really important base color for the darker scales on top. I'm now going to go back with just the cadmium yellow and apply that to more selective spots on the dragon's head. A wash of Liquitex Sap Green is now applied to all the exposed areas of skin. This is going to help subdue the yellow just a little bit, but it's going to bring all of the colors for the entire head together. With my wash layer dry, I can now start to paint the individual scales. Using some sap green, which is the same color I used for the wash, I can start to apply my initial layer. Now this paint isn't very opaque, but it's all about covering the entire surface of each individual scale. I'll go back with a more opaque green later on. Now it's time to start bumping up those color contrasts, so I'm going to be using some Liquitex Dioxazine Purple. Now this is a very opaque paint, so try not to get it anywhere that you don't want it. But it's going to be a great color contrast around these eyes, and it's really going to make the eyes pop. I go ahead and add a slight wash to the lowest part just to help feather it out and blend it into the green. For the scales, I'm now going to mix up some chromium oxide green and cobalt green. These two, when mixed together, make a pretty opaque paint. They do a great job covering the individual scales. And here you can see how having the yellow wash under these scales, it really helps separate them and adds more visual interest. Moving on to the dragon's teeth, they're going to get a base layer of raw sienna. This paint is applied with a small filbert brush and a minimal amount of water. I want a good coverage on the teeth. While I let everything on the dragon dry, let's jump back over to the plaque. I'm going to do a wash of Liquitex Mars Black over the entire surface. This is going to help grunge up the plaque and start to get down into all of those recesses. Then by using a damp paper towel, I can remove the paint from certain areas while also adding an additional texture. With the dragon having a lot of blues and greens, I want the plaque to have a warmer tone, so I'm going to add a little bit of Dirty Down Rust. This is going to be selectively sprayed onto the surface, and then I can dry it with a hairdryer. Now Dirty Down sprays, if you've never used them, they are reactivated by water, so I'm going to use a large mop brush to help speckle the surface. This paint can then be moved around and lifted off using a damp paper towel. These paints are great and they give a lot of really cool variations to the piece that you wouldn't be able to achieve otherwise. Now because these paints though are reactivated by water, they need to be sealed, so I'm going to use some Valspar flat. So I have darker hues now applied to the plaque, and now it's time I add some highlights. Liquitex Iridescent Rich Silver is going to be applied with the flat of the brush to mimic edge highlights. It is a very controlled process, but I'm trying to get some variation in how much paint is applied. The Iridescent Rich Silver is also applied to the triangle dowels in select areas. This helps add interesting highlights to the piece. With the paint applied, I can now go back with a little bit more graphite powder, but I'm not going to put it on near as thick as I did in the beginning. And that's because I'm going to take a damp paper towel, I'm going to blot some of it away. This is going to help give it that appearance of aged metal. Back to the dragon, now I can clean up the horns using some Liquitex Burnt Sienna. I carefully paint the base of the horns using a small filbert brush. And just like the eyes, the warmth of this color helps separate it from the rest of the skin. While the horns are drying, I'm going to go back and highlight the teeth. The first highlight is going to be a mixture of raw sienna, unbleached titanium, and a little bit of that cadmium yellow. This paint is going to be applied heavily to the point of each tooth, and then I'll go back with a dry brush and feather that paint down to the base. This gives a nice transition, and having the base of the tooth darker really separates it from the skin. For the final highlight on the teeth, we're going to go with Liquitex Parchment. This is really only going to be applied to the utmost point of each tooth. But that little bit of color change helps separate it from that purplish pink on the inside of the mouth. For the first highlight layer on the horns, we're just going to go with some raw sienna. This paint is applied with a large mop brush in a dry brushing fashion. The whole point here is just to hit the edge tops. You don't want it running down into the crevices. For highlight number 2, I'm going to add a little bit of that tooth paint mixture into the raw sienna. I'm not going crazy with this highlight though, just enough to make the base of the horns look a little bit brighter. Now we're going to have a little bit of fun. Just like around the eyes, I want a contrast color on the horns. So once again, I'm going to use my dioxazine purple and some burnt sienna. These two paints mixed together are applied pretty heavily to the tips of the horns. Now to bring all the colors together, a very transparent wash of this mixture is going to be applied to the horns. The wash is applied making sure I get down into all of those details, and also to help feather out that transition between the tip of the horn and the base. And that little bit of purple with the red ties that whole color palette together. I'm enjoying the color combo of the purple and the green, so I also applied it to the dragon's beak. I feathered it as best I could with the mop brush, but then went back with a damp paper towel to take some of that pigment away. Again, that purple is a very opaque color on its own. The watered down purple is also applied to the mouth to help define shadowed areas. And of course I can't forget the inside of the dragon's nose. To give this creation some additional life, I'm going to be mixing up some 5-minute epoxy to act as a gloss for the mouth. Parts A and B are equally measured and thoroughly mixed on a scrap piece of poster board. I'm going to use a 1-inch throwaway chip brush to apply the epoxy to the piece. Now if you've never used it, epoxy smells terrible, so make sure that you're wearing a respirator during this process. The epoxy is then quickly applied to all of the teeth and stippled onto the tongue to give it a different texture pattern. The epoxy is also applied to the sides and the entire interior of the mouth. And again, I can't forget the nose. I even decided to add a little bit of it right underneath of the eyes, making sure not to get it on the bulbs. And you can see how this gloss just takes the entire mouth section to a new level. So you all can see the steps that I took to not only make, but paint my own custom dragon head. And I'm really happy with how this entire project has come out. I think it looks fantastic. Plus, this project is awesome because it is so customizable. You can make your own dragon head and really make it unique for you. And if you are building any of my builds or utilizing HD foam, be sure to tag me at SKS Props on Twitter and Instagram because I want to see your creations. Until next time, build your best with the best. HD Foam.